In a moment, I'm going to ask my boss, Jeremy Anderson, to come up to kick off the conversation, but I want to set the stage and give you a primer for what you're about to see. You're going to see a relay of two-person dialogues with a frame of looking forward into the future of policy opportunities for arts and education. These dialogues will be timed, so you're going to feel like you're standing in your kitchen, because it sounds a lot like a kitchen timer, okay? They're going to be timed, so you'll hear chimes throughout the running of the dialogues, okay? But what we expect from the conversation is not staged. We expect it to grow organically, and the conversations are going to change as the different conversationalists come up on stage. So that's a little hard to describe, but hang in there with us, and I think you're going to catch on quickly. Now, because the time is so short within these conversations, we've asked the speakers to not get caught up in talking about their backgrounds and their bios. You can find those in the program if you're interested more. But I'm going to tell you in an order of appearance who you're going to be seeing. First of all, Jeremy Anderson, my boss and the President of Education Commission of the States. Next up will be Dustin Loehr, who brings the perspective of the Arizona State Department of Education. Following him will be Heather Noonan, the Vice President for Advocacy at the League of American Orchestras, and she is also incidentally the co-chair of our ESSA working group. Heather Ikemire will be the second Heather on deck, and she is the Chief Program Officer at the National Guild for Community Arts Education. Following Heather will be David Dick, the President of Young Audiences. Martha McKenna goes next. She is a professor at Lesley University and also the co-chair of the AEP Higher Ed Working Group. Following Martha will be our friend Mario Rossero, who allows me to cheat off him on a regular basis from the Kennedy Center. He's Senior Vice President there. And Ayanna Hudson will round out the group, and she is the Director of Arts Education for the National Endowment for the Arts. I will be the last one visiting with Ayanna, and my goal is to tie this up with a bow and go forward to the rest of the programming. So with that, I ask you to help me in welcoming Jeremy Anderson to get us kicked off.
Well, I'm excited to start this, and as my wife of 22 years would tell you, I've never gotten a conversation done in 6 minutes. So I'm going to try to lead it off by hopefully making this work. You're going to hear as we're up here, we'll have about 5 minutes of speaking, and the first alarm will go off, telling us we have 60 seconds to wrap it up, get out of our chair, and allow the next speaker to get up here. And I think it can go pretty quick. So we can go ahead and start the timer. I'm excited to talk a little bit about what I see transitioning in policy, not necessarily just arts, but policy, because I want to lay a framework. Yesterday at the plenary, Matt Carter from Visit Indy, he sat up here and talked about how we need to start figuring out how we explain the why with the what policymakers are interested in. And I think that's a really important thing, because I think sometimes we're always talking about art and art education. That may not be in the sphere that policymakers are worried right now. So what is it that they're thinking about? One of the things we do at the Education Commission of the States are information requests. Governor calls my office, says, we're going to do something for high school dropouts. Can you make us an expert on that in the next week? So we do private memos for governor's offices, legislators, chief state school officers. Last year, we did 750 unique private memos for these people across the country. So I want to show you what those look like. So when we talk about our information requests from 2017, 750 of them, 3 were on arts education. That's not a negative, that's just saying that's not where they're thinking right now. There were 8 that were on social and emotional learning. There were 11 that were on data. 93 on choice. That's not necessarily charter schools or what can you do differently. It's just choice, big picture. Some of it is how do we allow more choices for more curriculum in high schools. The other 2 that aren't up there on the slide because we didn't have enough room are STEM and dual enrollment. How are you allowing students the opportunity to be dual enrolled in a high school and getting college credit? I think this is important because from our perspective, these are the whats that policymakers are thinking about. So let's look at legislation a little bit from this 2018 legislative session. We track every single piece of legislation across the country in all 50 states and in Puerto Rico. I laugh sometimes and say our staff probably reads more legislation than some people who may have voted for that legislation. I mean that respectfully. But when you look at arts, in the 2018 legislative session, there were 13 arts bills. 3 of them were enacted. On social and emotional learning, there were 42 bills. Part of that is that the Every Student Succeeds Act has allowed some opportunities around social and emotional learning. But 3 were enacted, 2 were vetoed. On data, there were 44 bills, 10 enacted. And on choice, there were 488 bills, 56 of them enacted. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we talk about arts education on the issues that the policymakers are most focused on right now? And this is already happening across the country. I talked with Akua with Wolf Trap Foundation. I don't know if Akua's here this morning. There she is. I talked with her about work they're doing in Virginia. So they've actually taken arts education, and they've talked multiple times with the folks in Virginia about how they could put that into an early learning STEAM program. And they actually have funding where they're using arts education in early learning programs because the school districts want better 3rd grade math scores. Arts, STEAM, 3rd grade math scores. It's not traditional for you to go in and talk about how you want to change 3rd grade math scores. We usually go in and say we want to have more arts education. But in that case, there's a victory, and Akua is seeing the outcomes from it. Massachusetts has some information that they've worked on. They actually have dual enrollment programs at some of their high schools that allow you to get college credit for college arts courses while you're in high school. So again, there's an example of a policy where we wanted to change the outcome for arts, but we talked about the what with where the policymakers were. One of the things I want you to make sure to take a look at is the document that we've been working on that we've had the ESSA working group doing great work, and that's really the mapping opportunities for the arts. These are the chapters we have in this document, which continues to grow, and it's a great working group. But these chapters get into some of the minutia of ESSA, and that's good. We want to be looking at every opportunity we can use ESSA for arts and education. But if you step back and start thinking about what is the what that policymakers are thinking about, these chapters might be easier to explain to a freshman legislator or a new governor or a new chief state school officer under these categories. You want to talk about equity, and you think arts can help them in providing greater equity on curriculum. Or you want to talk about social and emotional learning, and you see where your arts programs and arts education can help them to fulfill some of those needs in ESSA. A big one that we're seeing in a lot of states is questions around family and student engagement. So how do you take the arts programs that you're promoting and start to talk about them about family and student engagement? Okay, I'm getting close. Dustin, you get to come up next. But this is a really important aspect, I think, from my perspective, working with policymakers. Sometimes when I am in states and I'm talking about what we're doing with the Arts Education Partnership, they're interested, but there's not a lot of action. But when I can talk to them about what Virginia did and taking arts and making it part of an early learning program that's focused on 3rd grade math scores, they're saying, where is that legislation? Can you help us look at that? Can you help us put that in place? So perspective matters in this with policymakers, which is the one thing I'd want to make sure that you can talk about. Come on up, Dustin. Good to see you. So Dustin, your experience inside the state education agency is interesting, especially at this time when we've had a lot of change with the Every Student Succeeds Act. Talk a little bit about some of the policy changes and opportunities you've seen through that.
Yeah, you know, one of the policies and opportunities that I want to really highlight is the increased flexibility that is present in ESSA. You know, it's easier to activate your Title I dollars to provide arts education interventions. Your Title II dollars to provide professional development for those teachers who are serving our Title I students in the arts. And of course, there is the Title IV, which is our saving grace and our wonderful funding source that is largely untapped in terms of the arts. And so that's a wonderful opportunity for us to explore moving forward.
Have you seen any major shifts in Arizona or in other states because of ESSA, where policies are moving pretty quick?
Yeah, you know, one of the big shifts in ESSA is this transition from this idea of research-based versus evidence-based. And I think that's a really important distinction that we really need to understand in the arts. Because in the past, any time that we activated the federal funds for an intervention or an activity, it had to have research backing. Now, under ESSA, there's this evidence-based notion. So, for example, if you wanted to do an arts education intervention with Title I students, and you didn't have the evidence or the research to show that that was actually there, we could decide and create evidence ourselves, which could then potentially allow for the activation of those funds for that activity. It's a huge opportunity.
It is. It's one that we see in a lot of states, and we don't see a whole bunch of policymakers understanding that evidence-based can be one of the promoting reasons that their project could actually get some of the funds. What assistance do you need in arts education? I mean, many state education agencies are understaffed. They're much smaller than they were 5, 6, 7 years ago. What do you need help in?
You know, that's a big question. A lot of folks misunderstand what it is that an arts education specialist or director within a Department of Education can actually do. A lot of times we're the folks that gather people together, we share resource, we share guidance, but we aren't the people that can actually say anything, if that makes sense. We can give the information for other people to say, but we can't be the folks that are driving that change. So that's one thing. But I think the biggest need is for our stakeholders to really engage with policy members within the school accountability systems or the A through F report cards. I'm seeing that the states who have been successful in getting arts education within those systems are having a much larger impact within arts education across the state. And finally, that notion of literacy. And what I mean by that is, arts education, we spend so much of our time working within the standards to create artistic literate students. But I feel like our stakeholders and the field in general needs to increase our own policy literacy. There's so much that has changed within ESSA. There's so many opportunities that are available to us within arts education. But if we don't understand them, if we're not literate of those policies, then we're never going to be able to really activate them.
That's a great point. Dustin is a great example of one of those policymakers who has a wealth of information, but sometimes limitations on what he can do because of where his position is. And I talked with Dustin a little bit on this. I mean, of the 50 chief state school officers in America, 13 of them are actually elected officials. Dustin's boss is an elected official who didn't win the Republican primary. So there will be a new boss for Dustin in January. And so these changes make it difficult for him to be able to always be the advocate for arts. There's about a third of the other chief state school officers that are actually appointed by the governor, so pretty political, and the other third are actually appointed by state boards of ed. And so figuring out that dynamic is an important one, depending on which state you're in. Talk a little bit about an arts education success that you're most proud of.
Well, we just launched our arts education data project with Quadrant Research. It came out on Monday. So I'm really excited that for the first time, we can really look at access and participation in the arts across the whole state. It's a really exciting development. Additionally, Arizona has always really had a good tie with arts education and Title I. But this year, we are intentionally partnering with our Title I unit to include the arts within our statewide ESSA conference. And Jane is actually going to be joining us at that conference, which is really exciting.
That is great.
And creative youth development is another awesome opportunity that we are exploring in partnership with our Commission on the Arts.
Tremendous. So we're down to the last minute, and I know Heather's going to be coming up here. Talk about the one challenge around arts education policy that you see moving forward.
I think it ties back to that notion of the state report card. That's been a really driving advocacy effort within Arizona, and we just really haven't had much traction. And it's tied back to being able for, at least in Arizona, for us to speak to student academic growth and achievement within the arts education standards. And if our teachers are not using those standards reliably or consistently, then we're always going to be short at meeting that mark that the state board has created for us.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dustin.
Thank you. Hi, Heather. How are you?
I'm good, Dustin. How are you?
Good. That's like a whirlwind up here, but I'm really excited to meet you for the first time and learn more about the work that you do for all of us. Could you share a little bit more about, the work that you've done in ESSA?
Yeah, well, we bonded a little bit over coffee and public transparency on access to arts education. So what you launched on Monday, I think, is really very much directly tied to what the Arts Working Group and stakeholders in states and local districts are finding is a really important policy trigger, which is having some public accountability for gaps in access to arts education. I know we're supposed to be looking forward here, but just a quick glimpse back on our ambitions for ESSA. Our ideal outcome was going to be to have states required to annually publicly report on the status of arts education in the schools, thinking that that transparency then triggers the policy conversation about where are the gaps and how do we address them. So, and speaking about policy literacy, I think coming out of ESSA, since it took a very light-handed approach to directing states to do pretty much anything, to your point around flexibility, we saw the mapping document as an opportunity to equip arts advocates with that policy literacy. Where are the opportunities in the law we have so that we can be activated to support folks in your position? Again, since you can't make the ask, the imperative is on the advocates at the state and local level to shape the request. And I also really take to heart what Jeremy had to say about framing it in the terms that education reform leaders are working with. So another one of the advocacy strategies, I think that, anytime someone comes to Washington and says, let's go on the Hill and have meetings together, we have colleagues here who guide folks through that process on Arts Advocacy Day. We're always encouraging advocates to start by asking the staff in the room, what's on the top of your desk? What's your priority today? And just to sit and listen to that first. So being able to responsibly step into that conversation with the right context has been, I think, a really important strategy. And for orchestras, as community-based organizations, kind of take off my coalition hat for a second and look at our own field, we just relaunched our Statement of Common Cause in support of in-school music education, which lays out some principles for how to engage in kind of stepping away from a focus on community-based programmatic delivery by organizations like orchestras and shifting to how do we responsibly engage in this more systemic conversation about supporting in-school music education opportunities.
Yeah, speaking of systemic conversation, one of the requirements in ESSA is that states submit an annual state ESSA plan. What advice would you give on a state who doesn't have arts education within their state ESSA plan?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to what's been successful over the last year, where states are incorporating this, and it's having stakeholders show up and be a part of the conversation. So there has been a consultation requirement for states to have public conversations about what's shaping their plans, and it's not too late by any means to get engaged in that dialogue, right? I mean, those opportunities recur.
Yeah, they're ongoing.
Yeah. So I would say, and to look to the third-party advocates who can make that case in the conversation, so that it's not necessarily, and that's again where I think community-based organizations and school partners have an opportunity. If it is a mayor coming to that conversation and saying what we need in our school is the arts, it's received differently than if it's an arts organization coming to the conversation and saying what we need in our school is more arts. So I think being creative about who brings that voice. I'd also say in terms of plans, there's a huge opportunity right now for Title 4A that we should discuss because you're in the mix of it.
That's
right
my
now.
next question. Good job. Yes, Title 4A, that's the wonderful new exciting funding source. I wanted to speak to you about the flexibility of Title IV-A and how that can be both a good thing and potentially a deterrent. And what I mean by that is our LEAs have an option to transfer a portion or all of their Title IV funds out of Title IV to a different funding area, which may or may not activate well-rounded education or the arts. What advice would you give to schools in putting those funds where they belong within Title IV?
So the first step in this is a needs assessment, right, by schools. So, and if you're not familiar with the Title IV-A fund, it has grown. So in the last fiscal year, Congress put $1.1 billion into this. The first year it was not funded. It is funded now at a point where these are resources accessible to states and locals. And there's also a chance for the arts to make their case of how they're connecting to the priority of the schools. So where social emotional learning comes into play, this is an opportunity for, if that's the direction they're heading with Title IV-A, it's an opportunity for us to connect with those goals.
So it's not so much about the need, but the how does the arts provide the solution?
Yeah.
Which is sort of the theme that we're seeing today.
And also get in the conversation early, before the states and locals start locking in on a direction they head with 4A for years over time.
Well, Heather, it was nice to meet you. Thanks for chatting.
You. Thank you. I'm going to welcome David Dick, or I'm sorry, Heather.
Next, Heather.
Hi, Heather.
Hi, Heather. It's, Heather's the musical.
Yeah.
Heather's the long conversation.
Here we are.
So we talked just for a second there about social emotional learning and Title IV-A, and Jeremy mentioned it as a key theme that state leaders are really approaching. And your perspective on being very deeply engaged in creative youth development ties up to that theme as well. Can you play out a little bit how you see the connections?
Sure, absolutely. So for creative youth development, we're really talking about the intentional integration of youth development principles with arts learning practices. And I think one of the things that has been very clear is that creative youth development is not a type of program or a type of organization, but really a practice that has, huge impacts on social emotional learning. And many of the priorities, to get back to Jeremy's point around the what, really aligns with not only student achievement, but with priorities around engagement and positive social behavior. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to be thinking about how we can explore opportunities within ESSA and within existing school initiatives, policy initiatives, that can create an opening for creative youth development practice to really thrive in schools. I think it's a practice that has really been focused in out-of-school time in many circumstances because the environment of the out-of-school time learning area, really fosters deep engagement, sustained relationships with peers and adult mentors over a period of time, and really creates conditions where young people can lead and have really profound positions in decision-making and leadership within those programs. But that doesn't mean that can't really thrive in school environments too. And I think there's a huge opportunity for us to be thinking about how we support that practice during school time as well.
I remember when the blueprint was being drafted, and there was a summit in Boston where folks came into the room to talk about what are the qualities of this approach that work across communities of practice. And you had a lot of young people in the room who were firsthand a part of that dialogue, and it really completely changed the tone of the conversation. Can you talk a little more about how that agency for young people and part of this policy dialogue helps propel things forward?
Absolutely. I think core to creative youth development practice and principles is youth voice and choice. And it's recognizing young people as leaders now, not as leaders in the future. And so I think as we have conversations about policy opportunities, we need to be looking at opportunities where young people can be part of those conversations and be part of, be at the table when we're talking about policy, funding, decision-making around grants and how they're allocated. And there's some great examples, even in Phoenix. The city of Phoenix has a really phenomenal Arts and Culture Youth Council that meets regularly to discuss issues that relate to their lives and their communities, and really helps to weigh in on decisions around policy and funding streams. And so I think those models around in local communities are really inspiring, and will really help, I think, to move their work forward in a way that centers those who are most affected.
That's great. Do you have any additional thoughts? And we've been comparing notes over the last couple of days about new opportunities for community-based organizations to get more engaged in the policy process, and talking about how you can initiate those conversations around where the gaps to access are. Can you talk a little bit more from the experience of young people engaging in that and helping to identify where the art is making is happening and where it's not, whether it's in school or in the out of school time?
Sure. Well, I think that there's a huge opportunity. One thing I think that's really characteristic of a lot of CYD organizations is that they really scale for depth, not breadth. And so often, to your point around sort of identifying gaps, they may have limited capacity in terms of staff or ability to collect robust data over time, but they work. CYD really thrives when organizations are working together and there's a network working together to share data, to evaluate impact, and to talk about where there are opportunities for people to collaborate and do more work together. So I think when young people can be participating in those conversations, and when organizations, both arts and non-arts, who are working for better outcomes for youth, come together across the community, young people are better served.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think now I will hand it to Dick.
Thank you. Hey, Heather.
Hi, David. How are you?
Call me Heather if that's easy.
Well, great. So it's so nice to see you.
As well.
And I know I'm really excited to talk with you about the standards. And I know there was a slide yesterday at yesterday's plenary that mentioned that all 50 states now have art standards, which is phenomenal.
It's phenomenal. Yes, it is.
And could you tell us a little bit about sort of the process that it took to get there, and maybe a little bit about what's to come next?
Sure. So, the interesting thing is, first, the new standards are now 4 years old, right? So how things sort of creep along. And I actually had to look that up this morning. I couldn't quite remember. And just, was it 2 years? Was it 3? And I was sort of shocked by the 4. And up on the screen is a map. And maps tell interesting stories. So I think to your point, during the last set of standards over 20 years ago, Iowa was the one state that did not adopt the art standards, but didn't adopt any standards. And it was, I think, taking a look at this document and realizing there's something there. But, taking a look at the map, when we're looking at the dark blue, these are the states who have adopted new sets of standards. And the light blue are the states that are right now in a revision process. So, for instance, California is in a process right now. It's really out for review. Right now, they're saying by January they will bring it back to their state board of ed. What's fascinating when you look at the map is I think everyone in this room probably could draw for us an electoral map with the two colors and figure that out, right? And this refreshingly doesn't look like that. Right? And when we're looking at the yellow, these are not states who have rejected the new standards. They're just not there yet in the process. Or some states are saying, well, we kind of like what we've got, right? So I think the first thing is this has been a process for all states to take a look at their standards, right? And to really go back and look at that. Quickly, the red are just states that you're looking at that have adopted one or more of the standards, so they haven't looked at the whole piece. But right now, 27 of those states have. The story, which is interesting, and there's a lot of CDA colleagues in the room, is, over 4 years ago, there was a group of people talking about, boy, we're getting ready to take a look at our art standards again. And in the room, well, we are too, and we are too, and we are too. So with that was a interesting opportunity to do this collectively, right? As a national arts organization, my real interest here was in representing a large number of teaching artists. I think standards help to inform a conversation and can move the field beyond this notion of, oh, this is what we do, who wants us to come in and do it, to an outcomes-based, student-based conversation of these are the things that we want students to be able to know and do. Who are those partners that come in, and how does that happen? The most interesting part of this is, in the name of those standards, the National Core Art Standards, the word core was put in there specifically because in 1994, and that's really also where the beginnings of the Arts Ed Partnership came in with Goals 2000, the field had a real win by looking at the arts as a core content area, right, to have that in. Now, the interesting part there is at the same time that was being introduced, we also had the Common Core out there, right, and that whole conversation. I think what was fascinating about the development of these standards is at the end of the day, there were 7,000 educators and people in the field who either wrote or responded to those standards. So what's interesting is, we'll keep pointing to Arizona this morning, when their state board of ed looked at these standards, in the room were 7 teachers who either had written or reviewed some of those standards there. So in some states, when they were having serious conversations about the Common Core, at the same time where these standards, there was ownership at the state level through participation, it was a very different conversation. The other thing is, these standards are really set up, I think, to inspire state and local discussions. So there was never a benchmark set of, where's our win and who's, so some states have taken the whole thing. Other states have made some significant revisions and really thinking about their students and what's unique there. But I think, we all know in the room, process is more important than product, right? And my organization actually administers the website that these standards live on. And to date, we've had 3.15 unique users that have come to that website. So I think in itself, I think it's an incredible tool for teachers, for artists, for everything else.
You mentioned earlier that the standards are now 4 years old, and so looking ahead and thinking about a collective process and thinking about the ways in which states have both adopted but also are using the core art standards to think about revisions, are you seeing any trends in terms of the ways in which states are approaching revisions to their standards, or what we can expect going forward?
The interesting thing there is that some states, some of it's the revisions, so it's just about some language, but then some other states have added some interesting components to it. So for instance, in Delaware, they accepted the whole standards, but they also created a whole set of I can statements. And sort of this notion of, when these standards are achieved, what does this sound like in the voice of students? Right? Well, the interesting thing is, because these are all web-based, right? Everyone has access to everything else. Boy, that 4, 3, 2, 1. There we go. We're going to end there. But thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Martha, you're going to introduce Martha. I'll introduce. You're going. Martha, come on up. Martha, good morning.
So we're in a coffee shop.
We are. So, we've talked a lot about either policy or standards and everything else, but some of the rubber hits the road in higher ed, where you're really thinking about who's doing this work, what's art integration look like, teaching artistry, research, the whole thing. So I'm just wondering your perspectives right now on, you're going to do a little tying together a little bit here, but just what have you seen, especially in terms of higher ed's role in terms of this topic area of arts integration?
I have to say that it's all of that, and that's why it has to be collaborative. That higher ed can't do it alone, and in a session we had just before this, the higher ed working group, one of the members said, you know, higher ed has a lot to learn from K-12 education. And we know that. We have a lot to learn from the teaching artists and the art specialists and from the cultural organizations. So it's the integration that's so important, and our role in leading communities of practice, both at the university level and with districts. So I think we have a convening role. And it's interesting, you mentioned Goals 2000. And it was just a year after 2000 that Dick Deasy convened a number of us at Lincoln Center to talk about, we knew that Goals 2000 said that there has to be excellence in the arts education, and how integrating the arts have to have that excellence. But he recognized we needed to build the teaching workforce for that integration. And in 2001 at Lincoln Center, he convened us to talk about teaching partnerships. And that led to the development of the higher ed working group that Dick asked me to lead in 2005, and we are still going. 2 years later, we created a wonderful working partnerships, where we looked at the successful partnerships of Kennedy Center and Lincoln Center and universities and groups, and we reflected on what were the promising practices, because people were saying, yeah, we know it's a good thing, but how do we do it? And not to say there's one way to do it, but what are some of the lessons learned? And then in 2011, the President's Committee on Arts and Humanities said, in reinvesting in arts education, we need to build a field of arts integration. And so this higher ed working group of AEP said, okay, we're the group that should be taking a leadership role, and we created the book that everywhere I go, I show. That work of 2017 was the first time we were able to document the variety of approaches for arts integration, for professional development in arts education. There's no one way to do that. And I think that's where higher ed can play a critical role. We're not saying how to do it, but we're saying a process that might work when you bring the cultural organizations and the K-12 schools and higher ed together. So to get back to where you started, how do we take all the many roles and support them? We have to include the many voices.
From your experience at Lesley, when students arrive to your campus, and you've done some incredible foundational work in thinking about teaching artistry as a degree and a career, do they come with that identity, or do you have to shape it while they're there?
Well, most of our work in arts integration is actually on the graduate level.
Okay.
And we work with teachers across the country, as well as in Cambridge, to think about what is it that you have as a strength and where do you want to use that? So it could be in community arts. It could be in a classroom as a teacher, integrating arts in the kindergarten or the 5th grade. It could be the art specialist who wants to get advanced training to be the artist in the school leading so much of this work. It could be the teaching artist, much of what you're doing as well. How are we training all of these educators in what Dick Deasy called the arts teaching workforce? And we have to look at educating all of them, because the best is when a school comes together with all of these resources. Often there's been a dialogue, and we had some tough conversations at early. When you're here for 20 years, you get to be in a lot of the conversations. But an early conversation was a real a dialogue that was a tough one between the art specialists and the teaching artists and the classroom teachers, because are the teaching artists taking away from the art specialist the resources? If the classroom teacher can teach the arts, then do we need the art specialist? And what we've discovered over time is that when you have an active arts program, then the art specialist is needed even more, because they are the resource for the classroom teacher. They are the resource to bring in the artists. I was struck yesterday when all those young dancers were performing, and I turned to Heather and I said, wouldn't you love your daughters to have an experience like this? All children deserve this experience of being alive in the arts and being energized and engaged and feeling good about themselves. To do that, it takes a whole school approach. It can't be just one of us.
Well, and I think with those dancers, what you noticed there was a mastery of language,
Yes.
a mastery of the language of dance.
Yeah.
And when that fluency starts to come in, those were the opportunities where arts integration is
Yes.
possible, but you've got to know that language first. So with that, thank you so much. It's my pleasure to introduce up to the stage Mario.
Thank you.
Hi,
Hello, Mario.
how are you?
Good, and you?
Great.
Mario, I discovered, and the work of the Kennedy Center has been going on for 47 years. So
Not my work, but the Kennedy Center's work. Yes.
You weren't born then, but the Kennedy Center work. But for 47 years you've been doing this work. So you've evolved over time, and you're now in a place where you're doing some wonderful work with any given child. Would you like to talk about where you are now and how important that is to the work that we're all doing here?
Absolutely. As I listen to all the other conversations, I can't help but think about this arts ed ecosystem that we all exist in, and that there's so many different roles for folks to play, and there's such a lift that it really requires everybody in the room and beyond to pull this off. And so when I think about the Kennedy Center's role, we're programmatic, but programmatic with influence, right? We're quasi-federal, we're not fully federal, part nonprofit. And when we ask ourselves that question of what's our unique role, it's really about noticing some of these challenges and trends that we see, and also knowing about the best practices and how do we develop model programs that can address those challenges with some of the best solutions. So Any Given Child is a great example of that. Indianapolis is one of our sites, and Any Given Child is based on this collective impact model, which many of us both live and breathe and are discovering more and more about every day. But it's really the idea that the community really owns an issue or a problem. And in arts education, what we've done is found communities that are at this degree of readiness, and they apply. And it's really that you hear from the arts community, the school community, and then the mayor's office. So those sort of three legs of the stool come together and say, we're ready to prioritize and uplift the arts for all of our students. And we're ready to put some individual agendas aside and work together to coordinate efforts. That can be a big shift in conversations. So we have 25 sites right now across the country, all different shapes and sizes, and we're adding 2 more this year.
And Kennedy Center has done collaborative work. So from the perspective of higher education, what have been some of your successes in partnering with higher ed, as well as all of the other partners you've just mentioned?
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit more about Any Given Child. So it has a community arts team as really sort of the backbone of this. And so I always think of it, it's like Noah's Ark of advisory groups. So you have 2 of every kind. So we have teachers and principals and partners and philanthropists and representatives from the arts community, but you also have higher education. So you try to get all these perspectives at the table that are representative of larger groups, right? And I think what we found is that in some spaces, higher ed is really the backbone organization that is keeping the work moving forward, and there's some really deep partnerships. And in other places, they're sort of teed up to go to the next level, but that path is not always clear. So there's interest, but it's what's that clear path ahead?
And what do you think is, looking at the work of Kennedy Center, what has been your greatest success?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think one of the successes that I would call up is, through our ability to convene folks together from across the country, it's being able to have a room with that national conversation of practitioners from the classroom out, and our ability to really listen to what's going on and respond. I think that's a real strength. It's a kind of a quiet strength, but it's really powerful.
And Kennedy Center represents the country, and you're part of the U.S. Department of Education, so that service to the 50 states. How do you manage that? Because we're all talking about a national movement of collective impact, and certainly states are asking for opportunities to work closely to transform the experience of children in schools and the social and emotional learning. So is that part of what you also see as your mission and your critical role?
Absolutely. I always ask myself the question of, when you have this national charge and responsibility on your shoulders, how do you know you're doing enough in any given state or community? And I think what we try to do is to back up a little bit and say, we want some balance across the country. We would love to be in every state. We are in different degrees with different programs, about 40 programs, so they play out in different roles. But what we try to do is really be cognizant of the local community and culture, and that we might have a program framework, but we leave space to tailor the programming to meet the needs of that community. And that's one of the most important things we can do in this work.
And I realize we only have another minute.
Yeah.
What's the future goal for, where do you see Kennedy Center going and your work in arts education?
Great question. I'll talk a little bit more about Any Given Child just because we finished a year-long evaluation.
Good.
And what's teed up is that we could be more explicit about some expectations for reflecting communities in that community advisory team. So making sure that
Good.
we reflect the students that we're serving. That's really important. Thinking about it's a K-8 model. Is that actually K-12? Is that
Yes.
K-21?
Yeah.
Those are good questions.
Yep.
And then there's a piece about, we have our 5 arts disciplines that we talk about, but there's also arts and culture that surround that, outside of that.
Yeah.
And that gets to that local piece. How do we honor what folks in the local community might uplift as the art forms that they care about the most?
Now I know why you've been here for 47 years. Great program. Ayanna, Hudson's going to join us now.
Thanks, Martha.
Thank you.
Hi, Ayanna. How are you?
Hi, Mario.
Good to see you.
Good to see you.
I like these new specs.
Oh, thank
Very
you.
sharp.
Keeping up with you.
We have a little competition going on, by the way. So I know you know a little something about this collective impact work.
A little.
Yeah. We've been part of those conversations, but I'd love to hear what you're learning through that process yourself from the NEA's perspective.
Yeah, so I've been struck by the conversation yesterday, the conversation today, really about understanding the needs of policymakers, understanding the needs of local communities and what those priorities are, and how the arts can really, how we can align ourselves with and come to policymakers as a solution for some of the things that they are challenged with and across communities. And so there's something you just said about understanding the local needs, and I want to highlight just one example of some work that we've been funding in Newark, New Jersey that I've been struck by and have been keeping my eye on. And it's something that really hasn't come up in our conversations over the course of yesterday and today, but is really something that is definitely impacting local communities, and that's trauma. And the trauma that students that we are serving, what they are living with every day in their communities. So in Newark, some of the work that we're funding really is focusing on trauma-based care. And it's something that we haven't seen necessarily as a trend in the work that we're funding, but it's something I'm really interested, like I said, in keeping my eye on, and I want to highlight today. So we talk a lot about, and you talked about, the importance of partnerships. So some of this work in Newark, they're partnering with the Newark Healthcare Coalition. They're partnering with My Brother's Keeper in Newark. So really interesting partners that we haven't really seen in some of the other work that we're funding across the country. And they're really doing a deep dive into practice and into training. So training all of their teaching artists that are going into the schools around trauma-based care, really thinking about instructional practice based on trauma-informed practice. So I think that that's something that is in direct response to the needs of their local community that I think is really interesting. Again, we're kind of keeping our eye on that work.
Absolutely. And I think, with all our conversation about SEL, I think there's a real natural fit there. I know I participated in a hip-hop pedagogy conference that Jeff Chang did on the West Coast, and it was amazing how our hip-hop educators and teaching artists have really been embracing this story of trauma and trying to unpack that. And then you realize there might be generational trauma there. And, arts are typically a space that students can feel safer, and that comes out. So I would love to keep following this story and share the good ideas from that work.
Absolutely. And there's also Count Basie Theater, also in New Jersey, different part of New Jersey, but we're not funding that part of their work. But in conversations I've had with them, they're also engaged in conversations with healthcare and the medical field. So this might become a really great emerging trend across collective impact
And is
work.
there a platform for this to be shared out in the future?
Yes, in the sense that you mentioned you all are undergoing or about to release, and I'm anxiously anticipating the release of your report on collective impact. And working with the NEA's Office of Research and Analysis, I know Patricia is here, our Deputy Director of our Office of Research and Analysis. We've been partnering with them to do a deep dive in our collective impact investments and working with a team of consultants to help us really think about that work, to develop a logic model, as well as a theory of change. So we look forward to down the road setting ourselves up for a long-term evaluation to really be able to share what we're learning, some of those effective practices, and really to think about our own investments and collective impact.
Great. And so as we talk about, looking ahead on the horizon, I'm curious what other big projects or things are ahead on your agenda.
Funny you should ask, Mario. So I'm actually super excited to announce really publicly for the first time that there's going to be a federal increase for the Arts Education Partnership starting next fiscal year.
All right.
So both the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Department of Education we're both jointly increasing our investment by $75,000. There's going to be a $150,000 new investment on top of the $700,000 that we're already jointly committing to the partnership.
Very wise investment.
Yes,
Thank you.
I agree. And so that work is really going to focus on just really what we've been talking about yesterday and today around what are the issues that policymakers are focused on. So Jeremy put the slide up about the request from policymakers, which I hadn't seen before, but it just made me realize even how more important is the work that we're going to be embarking on together with the partnership. So these increased monies are going to be focused on school choice and STEM and the role of the arts in both of those. Policy landscape analysis, research, literature review.
That's great and perfect timing because I think it's time to bring up our very cool host, Jane Best, to close out the conversation. Thanks, Ayanna.
Thank you, Mario. Hi, Jane.
Hi, Ayanna.
So one of the things I want to talk to you about, just in really building off of what Mario just asked me in terms of looking forward to the future.
Sure.
So I just announced this great new federal investment in the Arts Education Partnership.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about what you see as next steps for the partnership? I know yesterday you talked about the 2020 action agenda,
Right.
and we're gearing up towards reaching 2020. So what comes next for the partnership?
Well, obviously we have eyes on 2020, and the AEP team and the Education Commission of the States are perfectly positioned to look forward about where arts and education fit in across the broader landscape of education policy. Now, with that in mind, we understand that what resonates with policymakers the greatest is great stories, great successes, being able to point to great data. And so what we really are pushing, and you heard me say this on the platform yesterday, is moving from blueprint to action, being able to provide real snapshots, real work, real life examples that are happening in communities and states around how states are not only actualizing their state plans, they're bringing in community groups, they're doing after school programming, things such as that. That's where we see it headed. And in addition to that, we see it headed in the direction of making sure that other people that are really shining a bright light on the importance of arts and education, we're really invested in bringing those folks into the tent alongside us, all moving forward in the same direction.
And what role do you see for everyone in this room and the actual partners of the Arts Education Partnership? What role can they play in helping to really actualize this 2020 action agenda?
Great. Being able to say your elevator speech. So, and being able to tell us who else you're working with outside your silo. When I took the stage 3 years ago, or 2.5 years ago, my first AEP annual convening, I told you, as a policy person coming into the arts world, what has struck me is I've never met such a passionate, gracious group of people. But there's a lot of time expended preaching to the people that they already know arts make a difference. Just as the sessions yesterday articulated, nobody's going to say arts education is a bad idea. But it's important to move outside of the group of people that are equally passionate and translate this work to a wider audience. So your ability to share your successes in your communities and your states and talk to us about who else you're engaging with, but even more importantly, who Education Commission of the States and the Arts Education Partnership can help you engage. Because we want to be able to elevate your successes to not just a state level, but a national level, so other states and districts can learn from you.
And who are some of those non-arts partners that the Arts Education Partnership is looking to leverage relationships with and to bring them into the fold of the partnership?
That's a great question. So some of the non-arts partners, a great example is many of you were at the annual convening last year where Earl Franks, who's the head of the National Assembly, or Association of Elementary School Principals, through some of these great national, education organizations, we are going to see a lot more legs for arts and education. In addition to that, business roundtables, a lot of states are having business roundtables that are engaged in the process, strong community and local groups, and also great research organizations. We continue to stay aligned with the American Education Research Association because we know that these are the things that are really important to advance arts and education.
And can you talk a little bit about what some of those conversations sound like? As I heard you just share with everyone, it's important to, and really the theme of yesterday and today, this conversation about alignment.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about what some of your conversations look like with some of the non-arts partners?
Yeah, so for example, I know there's some folks from Indiana here, and I know that Indiana has historically always had a really strong business roundtable, and you've had great organizations such as Cummins and Eli Lilly, and asking them about what their workforce development looks like, asking them about how they are potentially identifying great creative minds in their STEM initiatives, and things like that. The business communities and the foundations that are invested in hiring those kinds of people and making sure they're bringing the best and the brightest forward for their respective work.
Any final thoughts in our last 30 seconds?
I'll just say we couldn't be more excited about the STEM and school choice opportunity and the work that AEP is expanding. And this is uncharted territory for us. So when you ask about conversations, these are top of mind for us right now, STEM and school choice. These projects will stretch us. So those of you in the room who know where we should be pointing our needle, we will welcome your feedback because we are really going to be in exploratory stages of those two topics.
Well, I look forward to working with you to advance that work.
Great. Please join me in thanking our great conversationalists.